I would argue that the collapse of the Late Bronze Age was so calamitous and so catastrophic that a similarity would not be seen again until Rome collapsed, which is 1,500 years later.
In the Late Bronze Age, you have these large kingdoms that dominated the whole region. It wasn't an era of city-states so much anymore like the early Bronze Age was. The Late Bronze Age already, you have large regional states, even nation-states you could call them.
These nation-states were highly sophisticated and urbanized, bolstered by a thriving international trade network and the spoils of war. Yet they were vulnerable to numerous threats.
None of these societies were really built to last a long time. They had kind of inherent fragilities and weaknesses that would sooner or later come to tell on them.
No one knows exactly why Bronze Age civilizations collapsed the way they did, but their highly stratified societies may have been a factor. One theory points to a growing inequality between the ruling elites and their dependents. Overtaxation, poverty, and oppression sparked internal dissent. People began to flee their kingdoms, seeking refuge in other lands and causing unrest throughout the region.
They were clearly posing a problem to the rulers, to the settled society, the elites of the Late Bronze Age. Sometimes there's treaties between the different kings of the Late Bronze Age, and the treaties include clauses about fugitives. How if a fugitive from your kingdom comes into mine, then I am liable to send them back to you. So clearly there's a problem that these rulers are dealing with people that are running away all the time.
Another theory adds climate change to the mix. During the end of the Late Bronze Age, there is increasing evidence that the climate was much drier, and drought became a persistent issue.
Agriculture in Greece is something which is always a struggle in terms of rainfall and would have been potentially precarious. And one of the suggestions that scholars are kind of working with now is that if they were to have several bad seasons in a row during one of these dry spells, I mean, think of a moment like the Dust Bowl here in the States, what you end up having is the basis of these societies, what we all cannot do without. Food starts to become a scarce resource.
If you didn't have the same supplies of water that you were used to, you couldn't produce the same amount of crops and sustain the same numbers of people, particularly all those people that weren't food producers themselves, all these elites and the specialists that are working for the elites. And if the agriculture is failing, then that whole system of all these parasitical people that are living off of the actual farmers and herders and so forth, that's all going to fall apart if they can't be fed.
While drought and famine may have helped topple these Bronze Age societies, it's possible the land itself created even more instability. There's evidence that powerful earthquakes once rocked the region.
Mainland Greece and the islands are a site of high seismic activity. They're right on a fault line, and so there are frequent earthquakes. The palaces were producing large quantities of olive oil and large quantities of wine and storing them in these giant pithos jars as tall as you or I, full of oil. And you combine that with lamps that would have been inside, like candles burning, earthquake, and these large drums of oil, and you get this recipe for disaster.
By the end of the 13th century BC, it was clear that many of the ruling elites were hitting a crisis point.
We see in text that people are writing letters back and forth to one another. So, for example, we hear evidence that there are groups that are attacking Cyprus. We also hear this from various different places along the Levantine coast and from Egypt itself. So this is the so-called Sea Peoples.
No one knows exactly where the Sea People came from, or why they were attacking cities and settlements along the coasts. Some believe they may have been refugees or disaffected people fleeing from hardship in their own homelands.
We have examples of letters going back and forth, letters from the Hittite king to the king of Ugarit saying, "You've got to let that shipment of grain get through. The people need it. They are starving." A letter from the king of Ugarit to the king of Alashia, I can't help you. All of my troops are in the Hittite realm, and I'm being attacked, so I'm left here vulnerable. So it's very clear that there were disruptions, there were people moving around, perhaps the so-called sea peoples, of disaffected people moving around and attacking the coastal areas.
Little is known about the mysterious Sea Peoples, a name given to groups of invaders who raided coastal towns and cities throughout the Mediterranean for nearly 100 years. They're mentioned in ancient Egyptian texts, attacking in two separate waves about 30 years apart.
They talk about these people coming from the north, they talk about them coming from overseas, and they actually give us the names of the groups. They talk about the Shardana and the Shekelesh and the Weshesh and the Esh, the wonderful names, the Denyen and the Peleset. Who are these people? The Shardana sounds a lot like Sardinia, doesn't it? But we don't know for sure if it is. Same with the Shekelesh. It sounds a lot like Sicily, so people have suggested that's where they came from. It's really only the Peleset that we think we know. They're probably the Philistines, and the Philistines are mentioned in the Bible as coming from Crete. So that might actually work. But, we don't know that much about them.
External invasions, internal unrest, climate change, and natural disasters. Scholars now believe it was a perfect storm of conditions that rocked the ancient world at the end of the Bronze Age.
Geographically, the collapse goes all the way from Italy in the west to Iraq and Afghanistan in the east, and it goes from Turkey in the north to Egypt in the south. From the western to the eastern Mediterranean, all that collapses. It would be Italy, Greece, and the Middle East as we look at it today. All that went down. It went down hard.
In less than 200 years, many of the great civilizations of the Bronze Age were in ruins. Their central economies collapsed. The elites died off, the art of writing was lost, and the great architecture disappeared. And with it all came the end of the vibrant international trade network that had long sustained the region.
Think about America's dependence on oil from the Middle East. The equivalent back then would have been this dependence on tin. Tin's only coming from Afghanistan. You cut the supply routes to the tin, and everybody's in big trouble. And I think that's probably what happens at the end of the late Bronze Age. But in the end, these trade routes are cut. Suddenly you don't have tin, which means you don't have bronze, which means you either collapse or you adapt. Some collapsed, some adapted.
For the next 300 years, the region plunged into what's known as the world's first Dark Ages, where fragmented, localized cultures lived more simply and freely, without the structure of a complex, organized, interconnected society.